Hey, this is David, pastor of Hamilton Life, and I want to thank you for taking a listen to our podcast.
We've been in a conversation called adaptation, where we've been looking at ways that we as human beings have been adapting to culture over Scripture. And if we continue down this path, what I've noticed, and if you look back through history, you've noticed as well that as human beings, we're very adaptive. We're very quickly and easily able to adapt to the culture or environment that we're in. However, just because we adapt quickly doesn't mean that it's always the healthy thing for us to do. In fact, when you begin to look at our lives, we're not the same human beings we were 100 years ago. We're not the same human beings we were 50 years ago or even 5 years ago, that we have changed dramatically in our mindset, our thought processes, and our actions, and the way we relate even to one another. And the problem with our adaptation is that we adapt so quickly that it becomes dangerous to our relationships and to our own health. And so we have to look and pause and stop and observe ways that we've started to live for self. We've lived to observe culture over Scripture and alter the way that we're living in an effort to live more like Christ has called us to live, the way He's created us to live. And so we've been looking at several different ways that we've been adapting because we believe adaptation is both intrinsic and it's a choice. And if we realize it's a choice that we get to make, then we can choose to change how we think and see the world and relate to the people around us. And so a couple of weeks ago, we started out by talking about money. And if you realize the habits of money and the way that we spend money is dramatically different than it was 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even last year. It just changes. We talked last week about time and how we relate to time, that our relationship to time has changed, that time is constantly fleeting, and we stay so involved in what's going on immediately that we forget the long game, and we just waste or squander so much of our time that we've got to embrace it and harness the time that we have. And so this morning I want to continue our conversation, and I want to talk about vulnerability. The word vulnerability has been at the forefront of my own learning process this past 6 months. I've been going through this process through numerous books and different ways that God has been inputting information into my soul. And I'm more aware now than ever of the importance of vulnerability. Vulnerability not just in how we relate to one another, but how we relate to God. And there's a strong correlation between how we relate to one another and how we relate to God. And if we're unwilling to be vulnerable in relationships with one another, then that filters into how we relate to God. And so I want us to have a working definition of vulnerability, okay? I didn't come up with this. I want us to have a working definition, though, that we can build off of, and we can all have the same sort of framework that I believe vulnerability should be defined as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Those three words scare probably most of us. Those three words scare me to death: uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Vulnerability, when defined as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure, look ridiculous to me. It looks dangerous to me. It looks like something I would run from, just as if I were to see a mugger in a dark alley. I just don't want anything to do with risk and uncertainty and emotional exposure. And yet what I've realized is that I'm only going to relate to the people around me and to the God that I serve so much if I remain guarded. If I remain unwilling to risk or to be a step into the unknown or to emotionally expose or fillet myself open, that I'm going to always remain guarded. And so I feel like we have to understand the importance of vulnerability. Really quickly, in the room, raise your hand. Let me finish. Raise your hand if you could walk out of this room right now. Let me finish. Raise your hand if you could walk out of this room right now and never feel love or a sense of belonging again. Is there anyone in the room that could say, I could walk out of this room right now? I'm just giving an example. This is not me saying I would leave the room. But could you leave the room without ever experiencing love and belonging? So it's interesting how much we feel like love and belonging is important to us. That I feel like if we could raise our hand, we would certainly need a deeper conversation. And maybe deep in your soul, you're like, yeah, I probably actually could. Then we should talk, because this is a very dangerous place for us to be as human beings. But now I want you to raise your hand if you believe that love and belonging are absolute essential human experiences in life. Anybody? See, if we understand the importance of love and belonging, then we have to understand the nurturing fuel, the soil, if you will, in which vulnerability begins to grow, and that is love and belonging grow out of our ability to be vulnerable, to risk and to be uncertain and to emotionally expose ourselves. If we understand love and belonging, then we have to understand that it comes only from our willingness to be vulnerable, to place ourselves in a emotional space where we are exposed and willing to let people see us for who we actually are. I believe, though, that we live in an environment that values the benefit of vulnerability, but doesn't actually want to be vulnerable. I believe that we live in a culture that values the benefits of vulnerability, love and belonging, or the sense of, or the feeling of, but doesn't actually want to be vulnerable and to do the relational work, to be vulnerable, to step into a space where we actually foster real vulnerability. So what we have is a generation of people that are fostering faux vulnerability, fake vulnerability. And we do this through social media because we post things that we want people to see. We do this through our conversations. I tell you stories that I want to reinforce the vibe that I have. I tell you things that I feel like are going to make me look positive or good. I'm not going to tell you something that makes me look lousy. I was yelling at my kids the other day. Nobody's going to say that. I wasn't. I'm just saying if I did, I wouldn't tell you, because we want to foster this sort of experience that we're good, that we're perfect. And everything that we do and speak and present to the people around us is to foster this idea that you have it all together. But we want people to think we're vulnerable, so we might throw them a little bit. Oh yeah, I had this small thing that's happened, and then people start feeling like maybe you're a little vulnerable. Like, hey, I'm on social media. You could follow my family as we go to random places, and you feel like you're just open, but it's really guarded because it's fake vulnerability. We see this in politics. We see this in the world of celebrity. We see this everywhere. That it's fake vulnerability. We think we have access to people of great power and position, and we don't have access to them at all, that it's all just a game that we play. And we teach that to our kids through social media. We teach that to our kids through the way that we relate to other people, that they can't actually be honest or authentic or vulnerable, but we have to present the idea that we are. And we're missing out on the benefits of actually living a life of vulnerability. And I believe that we remain guarded. We keep this front up. But if we are going to find our way back to one another, we will need to embrace vulnerability. That I believe that vulnerability is the path to connectivity. And if we're going to find our way back to one another, not you need more Instagram followers, not I need to boost my Twitter followers before the whole platform collapses, not that I need more fake friends, but that we actually need to foster an environment to which we end up building stronger relationships between one another and also between us and our Heavenly Father. And if we're going to do that, it's going to come through vulnerability. And we see this modeled in this story of a very unlikely friendship. In 1 Samuel 18, we find this really unlikely friendship, these two men, David and Jonathan. And they're together and they have this idea that there's a friendship that could never happen, but then it begins to bloom and foster and grow. And if you know the story of David and you know the story of Jonathan, then you understand the climate in which these two end up coming to know one another. If you're not familiar with the story, we'll begin to unpackage that a little bit, but it's highly fascinating. We don't have time to go into all the nuances and details, but it's a fascinating friendship. And it starts out in chapter 18, verse 1, and it says, when David had finished speaking with Saul, Saul was king, Saul was also Jonathan's dad, Jonathan committed himself to David, and he loved him as much as he loved himself. However, Saul kept David with him from that day on and did not let him return to his father's house. Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him so much as himself. Then Jonathan removed the robe he was wearing and he gave it to David, along with his military tunic, his sword, his bow, and his belt. And David marched out with the army and was successful in everything Saul sent him to do. Saul put him in command of the soldiers, which pleased all the people and Saul's servants as well. This story has so many layers and so many facets. Saul is king. Jonathan is his son. He's the rightful heir to the throne. When Saul dies, Jonathan becomes king. However, God anointed David to become the next king. So Jonathan and David are essentially rivals. They're jockeying for the same position, and it's not like a bump in pay. It is a major position of political power, and there should be rivals. They should, for all intents and purposes, be looking for ways to eliminate one another or to disarm one another, to remove them from the picture. But instead, what happens is Jonathan recognizes God's call in David's life, and he commits himself to be there for him. And I believe if we're going to step into vulnerability, the first thing that we've got to be willing to do as followers of Christ is we have to be committed. We have to be committed. As human beings, there are very few things that we are actually committed to if we look at our lives. You're committed to work because there's a reward at the end of the week for us. You're committed to church, obviously, because you're here and you're fantastic. You're committed to your family because you're a wonderful person. Beyond that, though, there are very few things. You might be committed to a hobby or a sports team. Kentucky just won and broke the 31-year record, so we're committed to that, starting a brand new record. The idea is that we're committed to very few things, but we choose what we're committed to. Commitment is a choice that we make. And wherever your time and your money and your resources go, that's where your commitment is. And a lot of us, we don't recognize that we're choosing our commitment level until you look back and realize, where did all my time go? Where did all my money go? And we're able to recognize where we are committed. But Jonathan looked at David and he committed himself to him. It says that the reason this worked is because Jonathan actually loved David more than himself. See, I think as a society, one of the reasons why we struggle with commitment is because we cannot get to a place where we love others more than ourselves. And the reason is because the vast majority of us don't truly love ourselves. If we're honest, if we're going to be vulnerable, if we're going to have emotional exposure, the vast majority of us don't really love ourselves. That we're actually never able to love other people more than we love ourselves. And if we don't have a very high value of ourselves, we're not really committed to ourselves, to making ourselves better, to get in better mental shape and physical shape, to get stronger and healthier. If we're not committed to ourselves, how can we ever be committed to the people around us? And Jonathan proves his ability to be vulnerable by committing himself to loving him more than he loved himself. But love is not something we get or we earn, but it's something that we nurture between two people who understand love's value. That a lot of us step into a relationship with other people. It could be a friendship, it could be a girlfriend, boyfriend, could be even a marriage. And we expect love to be given to us. But love isn't given to us. It's not something you earn. It's something that we work for. It's something that we foster between two people. And love is almost immediately squashed when vulnerability is taken out of the picture. When commitment is removed, love is almost always reduced to nothing. And so the challenge is for us to love ourselves, to take care of ourselves, but then in return to love the people around us as much, if not more than ourselves, and commit to them and put ourselves into a place where we are fostering love. Because if the story of your life, how many people can you truly say that you love more than yourself? In the story of your life, if they were to write your story, right? And I'm a brilliant author who's penning a story about Chris's life, and he's this romantic who's hopeless and helpless, and he's in the scene of The Notebook, and I'm writing all the people that he's committed to and loved. How many people could I write into the novel or the story of your life that you love more than yourself? That for the vast majority of us, it would be a really small list because we can't get past the commitment, the love to trust other people. And so Jonathan begins to live out his covenant. He begins to live out his covenant friendship. And I believe that it's covenant, not condition, that opens up the opportunity for vulnerability. I believe it's covenant. It's not condition that opens up the opportunity for love. It's the environment in which vulnerability and love and compassion and belonging are fueled. It's covenant, not condition. The idea that any relationship could thrive in an appropriate condition is positive. Yes, the condition is good, then the relationship will survive. That's why we call the first year of any marriage the honeymoon period, because it's fantastic for the most part. The problem is when things get challenging, your commitment level gets challenged. in any relationship, including your relationship with Christ. When the condition changes, your commitment level changes. However, if we recognize that we are committed by covenant, not by condition, then it changes how we're committed to one another. We're going to be committed to one another regardless of the conditions in which our relationship resides. So if you may discover information tomorrow, we might find practical information that might refute the Bible, the scriptures. Does that change our commitment to God? Does the condition change our commitment to God? Does our condition change our commitment to one another? Does our condition change? Do we change our commitment? Because a lot of us were committed out of convenience. We're committed to one another as long as it's convenient for us. But vulnerability actually places us in a headspace that says, I'm committed to you even when it's not convenient for me. It's not convenient to be married. My wife will tell you that. It's convenient for her because I'm awesome. It's not convenient for me because she's so demanding. The idea is that it's not always convenient to be in relationships with the people around you. Sorry, babe, you're usually not in here. So the idea is that it's not easy to be in relationship with one another. We call this a tribe. And hopefully that doesn't scare you, or we not like tribal, but we kind of aren't tribal. The idea is that we're here for one another. And part of being in relationship with one another in a community of faith like this one, in a tribe like this one, is that we're vulnerable, that we're committed, not out of condition. We're committed out of covenant. We're committed because God has called us here. We're committed not because it's convenient to be your friend or because you benefit me and you bless my life and you're good for me. We're committed because God has called us. That's covenant relationship. God has called us to be together. And vulnerability says, I'm going to be there for you regardless of how you treat me, regardless of how you respond to me, regardless of what you give me in return. I am going to be committed to you. And Jonathan and David step into this. And Jonathan actually takes it a step further in 1 Samuel 20, verse 16. He says, then Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord hold David's enemies accountable. Jonathan once again swore to David in his love for him because he loved him as much as he loved himself. That a biblical covenant is more than a handshake and a wink. A biblical covenant is more than putting a ring on and saying a few vows. A biblical covenant is something deep and long-lasting. And I believe we've got to be willing to allow people into our lives. But we only do that when we love ourselves, when we understand who we are, flaws and all, and we're able to love other people as much as ourselves, and we're able to commit to them. That I believe vulnerability requires commitment. And the first commitment we have to make is to God. If we look at vulnerability in the definition, it's uncertainty, it's risk, and emotional exposure. Our relationship to God is all of these things. It's uncertainty, it's risk, and it's emotional exposure. That I believe we commit to God first and foremost, because faith without vulnerability is just politics. That we need vulnerability in our faith with Christ. We need to be willing to step into the uncertain and not be afraid of the unknown, not be afraid of asking questions about who God is and if he's real. We're not afraid of asking God the hard questions because God is bigger than any question you could ask. He's not offended by your uncertainty or your understanding of the risk you take to follow Christ. God understands that a relationship with him requires emotional exposure. And so what happens so often is that we guard ourselves. We close ourselves off to those aspects. And God is inviting us to open ourselves up to him first and foremost. And it's our commitment to God that ends up leading us to have a commitment to the people around us. It's out of our commitment to God that we end up with a commitment to the people in communities of faith like this one, in neighborhoods and families, in cities and states, globally. That's only because we're committed to God that we're able to be committed to other people. It's only through the strength that comes to us from a relationship with God that we can be committed to one another, that a commitment to Christ invites commitment to others. The second thing that we must understand in order to foster vulnerability is that we must understand authenticity. We have to understand commitment. But we also have to understand authenticity. Authenticity is a buzzword. It has been for a while. It's a buzzword that we often use and don't fully understand. We think being authentic is just telling people all of our problems. We think being authentic is just spilling our guts to anyone and everyone. And if you've ever been in the grocery store line and just had a complete stranger tell you all their problems, you didn't feel like that was authentic. You thought that was awkward and weird because that's not authenticity. Authenticity is not just spilling your guts to anyone and everyone. Authenticity is so much deeper. It's actually the practice of letting go of who we are expected to be and embracing who God made us to be. That authenticity is the practice of letting go of who we are expected to be and embracing who God has called us to be. And that's extraordinarily difficult. Extraordinarily difficult. But not living the life that God has called you to live, not being fully who God called you to be, is so much riskier and more dangerous, and it's a lot more challenging than actually letting go of who people think you should be and embracing who God's made you to be. Now, this does not mean that we ignore our flaws. It does not mean that we ignore our character flaws or our bad behavior. It doesn't mean we ignore our sins. It doesn't mean that we just embrace them or allow our sins to become part of our identity. It doesn't mean that we just embrace it all and go, yeah, I'm just a flawed person. It's okay to be a flawed person working on getting better. You're not judged on who you are. You're judged on who you are becoming. And so part of authenticity is recognizing our flaws and failures, but not embracing them as much as it is that we work on them in an effort to get better, but understand that perfection is not attainable. See, we feel like we step into a relationship with people and we have to be perfect before we can be vulnerable. I'll be vulnerable with you. I'll be authentic. I'll be honest with you the second I'm perfect. Because if you're going to see the true me, it better be completely clean. It better be really nice. It better be cleaned up and tidy and ready to go. And so as soon as I'm perfect, I'll be vulnerable so that you can see how perfect I am. But I need you to know, one, perfection is not obtainable. That it's only through Christ and his forgiveness and grace that we're able to even be where we are at this moment. The perfection is not obtainable. And even if it were, nobody wants to see that. Nobody wants to see your perfection. We want to see your authenticity. We want to see your struggle. We want to see that you're human and real, just like everyone else. And that actually inspires and encourages, and it points us to a God who loves us for who we are, but compels us to become who he's called us to be. And that is authenticity. And in 1 Samuel 18:4, Jonathan begins to step into this commitment and this authenticity at a deeper level. He goes all in on this relationship. And in verse 4, he says, then Jonathan removed his robe that he was wearing, and he gave it to David. He probably had some stuff on under it, I'm sure. And along with his military tunic, maybe that was it, his sword, his bow, and his belt. This is a really strange, I'm not willing to be friends with anyone like this, right? You just keep your clothes and I'll keep mine and we'll be fine. The idea, though, was so much deeper than him just saying, hey, here's my clothes. The idea was so much deeper than him just saying, hey, I'm going to shed everything that's around me. This might seem like a really odd or strange or weird thing, and it would probably still be today. But it was so much deeper. Where Jonathan should have been looking at David as a rival, where Jonathan should have been looking at David as a way to eliminate him or reduce him. Instead, he was actually giving him everything. History actually tells us that he gave him his sword. I think the scriptures even mention his bow. He's giving him everything that he has to fight him, and he's giving it over to David, saying, I'm fully committed and trusting you in the most authentic and vulnerable way, that whatever I have is now yours. This is a level of commitment and authenticity that so many of us don't reach because so many of us live with armor on. Do you know that you live with armor on? That we all have armor. You can tap your chest and hear it clink. We all have armor on. Right now you have your church armor on. Tomorrow you're going to have your Monday work business armor on. And a lot of us, what happens is we live with armor constantly on us so that we feel guarded. We're not letting other people get close enough to us. They never see the real us. They only see what we think, and they can't hurt us if they can't get to us. And as long as we keep armor on, then we're safe and we're protected, and we're not exposed emotionally. We're not vulnerable. We're not authentic, and we're fake authentic, and we're fake vulnerable so that people don't see the armor. But we all have armor on. And we end up putting this armor on at an early age. There's a certain point in one's life where you start realizing that you can't be too emotional with people around you because you'll get hurt. And so you start guarding yourself. And as a culture, we fuel that and we foster that. Suck it up, deal with it, put a smile on, just keep smiling. Don't worry about it. Don't cry in front of people. Just come on. And we start putting armor on, and we put it on, and then the longer that we start wearing armor, the more exhausting it becomes to take that armor off. And so we just leave it on. We end up living our lives With armor on, we go to work, and then we come home, and we're still guarded, and then we get back up, and we go to work, we're still guarded. We come into environments like this one, and we're guarded, and we're keeping people at an arm's distance that they see us, but they don't see the true us. And a lot of us do this to protect ourselves, but vulnerability is actually the opposite. It's exposing who we truly are, even if that person isn't who we want to be. We get so tired of taking armor on and off, and sometimes many of us, we have specific armor for specific rooms. So we have armor for church, and we have armor for home, and we have armor for when we're with our spouse, or we have armor for when we're with our kids, we have armor for when we're at our work, or whatever, school, and we're changing armor all the time. Who am I supposed to be in this environment? Who am I supposed to be in this moment? And what Jonathan is showing us is that he's just disrobing. He's just getting rid of all of it, his belt and all. It's just done. And I have to wonder how many times in my life, if I look back through my life, have I gotten to a place in a relationship or even in my marriage where I am willing to be completely exposed and vulnerable with another person. No armor, no guard, no shield. This is me, good, bad, ugly, handsome, whatever word you want to use. This is me. Because we're only vulnerable. We only take the armor off when we think we're perfect. So many of us just never take it off. And even if you reached what you think might be a level of perfection, by the time you reach that level, your idea of what perfection is would have already changed. That we're chasing our tails by chasing perfection. Instead, we should be chasing vulnerability. We should be chasing the opportunity to be authentic and to be honest and not just floodlighting and throwing out all of our junk to random people, but actually fostering and building the relationships necessary to where you can share your deepest burdens with someone that you trust. That you are emotionally exposed and you're able to step into that environment. And David and Jonathan specifically had every reason to be guarded with David, but instead he dropped it all. And I think we have every reason to be guarded with other human beings because I'll be really honest with you. In a room full of human beings, I'll be honest, human beings can hurt us very badly. Human beings are quite terrible individuals. We just can be. But we can't allow that to be the excuse for us to keep from building beautiful relationships because even though human beings can be terrible and awful and damaging, they can also be healing and helpful and encouraging. And we miss the good because we're afraid of the bad, and so we just keep ourselves from being exposed. The vulnerability is an opportunity for us to take off that armor. And we can start slow. Maybe you start when you come home and you just sit in the driveway and you go, okay, what armor have I put on? What guards have I put up to keep people from hurting me? And what can I reduce? What can I take off before I walk into the door? Maybe you start by going, okay, Monday morning, you're in the parking lot of your office space or your school. What do I need to take off? Maybe it's just a helmet. Maybe I'm going to start slowly. Maybe I'm just going to leave the sword in the car. Metaphorically. Practically always do that. Metaphorically, I'm just going to leave the sword in the car. We can't use the word gun anymore. I'm going to use the sword in the car. I'm not going to take that with me just today. I'm just going to try it and see. I'm going to slowly begin to remove pieces of armor to see how others can begin to relate to me in a different way and let people start seeing us for who we truly are. And Jesus models this level of vulnerability like no one in human history. In John 15:12, it says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another." This is Jesus speaking. "That you love one another as I have loved you." In verse 13, "Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friend." Jesus says, "You are my friend if you do what I commanded you." This is such a beautiful opportunity. We understand what this vulnerability led Jesus to the cross. Many believe he was completely stripped naked and brutally murdered on a cross. The ultimate act of vulnerability, commitment, and authenticity. That Jesus went through all of this to connect with us, and yet so many of us guard ourselves to connect with him. When Jesus already sees who we truly are. He sees through our facade. He sees through our colorful language. He sees through our Instagram feed and our filters. He sees through all of it already. So why don't we relate to him in an honest and authentic way? Jesus has already related to us. It's our responsibility then to relate to him in the same way. And the last thing that I want you to know about vulnerability is that we have to be willing to take a risk. That vulnerability by definition is a risk. But here's what's interesting. If you're in this space and you think, I don't know if I could do that, I want you to know that you already are. Really quickly, put your hand up. I know you like this. If you love someone in your life. I do. I'm going to go ahead and put, thanks, March. Good. Okay. So I want you to put your hand back up if you actually have control over whether that person loves you back. Every single one of us who put our hands up for the first one are already experiencing vulnerability. You're already loving someone that you have no control whether they'll love you back or not. You're already being vulnerable in certain ways. We're picking and choosing because adaptation is a choice. We've got to choose to love other people beyond those that already love us back. The vulnerability isn't about waiting for someone to give us something. It's about us giving other people the gift that we so desperately need ourselves. Opening up, being willing to invest in relationships, friendships, and in people's lives. But it starts with Christ. That we love God, ideally. If you don't, we could connect you with Him. We'd love to get you connected and show you what love for Christ really looks like. But we don't have control over whether He loves us back. We have faith, we have trust, we don't have control. We're already in a vulnerable place, so why not just spread our vulnerability and watch that even though it's a risk, I believe that it's worth the risk. Vulnerability is always worth the risk. It means that we're willing to be hurt by other people. But I'll wrap up with 1 Samuel 18:5. It says, David marched out with the army and was successful in everything Saul sent him to do. So Saul put him in command of the soldiers, which pleased all the people of Saul. That it was a risk to step into this situation. It was a risk for David to step into a relationship with Jonathan and step into Saul. And if you know the story of Saul, Saul starts to lose it and it becomes physically a risk for him. But the call was on David's life so thick that he couldn't ignore it. See, I believe that God has called us to something great that we can't ignore, that it demands that we take that risk, that it demands that we become authentic, and it demands that we commit to living our life the way that God has called us to live, to stop becoming who people think we should be and embrace who God has called us to be and give it everything that we have. And watch how God begins to benefit and bless our lives through friendships and relationships and the people around us. But a lot of times what we do is we think vulnerability makes us weak. We think being vulnerable and authentic and even committed makes us weak. What the scriptures tell us is that for when I am weak, I am strong. That is our weakness of the flesh that actually causes us to lean on the strength of God. And I love the idea that even though vulnerability makes us feel weak, it actually takes more strength to be guarded than it does to be vulnerable, doesn't it? It's exhausting. It actually takes more work, more emotional strength for us to try to figure out who we're talking to, who we're hanging out with, who we're spending time with, and what they expect of us. See, I have a superpower. You didn't know this, maybe. I can walk into any room and talk to anyone and figure out within 5 seconds what we can talk about. I could look at Chris. Chris is wearing a jersey, and we can start talking about football. Just like that. I didn't even have to know Chris. I could just tell. He's got and you're probably good at this too. I can walk up and I can see, oh, you probably like music. Got it. We're in. We're talking about music. And I do this. You probably noticed if we've talked. I'm like, hey, how about this? And I just bring up a topic that I know you're going to be into. And we talk about it. It's a blessing and a curse. Because the idea is that when we use this to build relationships and to foster friendships and to show people that we care, then it actually brings us together. But a lot of times what we do is we use this superpower in order to fit in. We actually change who we are and what we believe in our emotional self to fit in. And what happens is when we change who we are to try to fit into people, to other people's circles or relationships or friendships, and we don't fit in, we end up leaving feeling left and empty and worthless. But if we actually embrace who we are, understand who God's called us to be, and be who you are in every room, in every environment, and not change who you are or what you believe to fit or to try to belong, then whether you belong in that group or not, you leave feeling like you belong to Christ because you are who He's called you to be. That you don't have to change who you are to fit in with other people. You don't have to stay guarded. That you can actually embrace who God's called you to be and watch how He ends up giving you the strength, because when we are weak, our strength then comes from Christ. That it actually takes a great deal of strength to open up, to set down the armor, and to let other people see you. And I think admitting that you're weak actually makes us stronger. And all of a sudden we find that we stop becoming the victim of our story. We start becoming the narrator. That ends up being the challenge for all of us, is that we stop becoming the victim of our story and we become the narrator. When we're honest and we own our story, we understand who we are and who God has called us to be, then we start being the narrator of our story. And when we're the narrator of our story, we actually get to dictate the outcome. As long as we're victims, we have no say on how our story will end. But as long as we embrace vulnerability and we allow our story to be told and we become the narrator, we get to determine where it ends. You don't have to stay the person that you are, that we get to become the person God's called us to be. If we'll take the armor off, if we'll embrace authenticity and commitment, and we'll be willing to risk. And so I believe if we're going to find our way back to one another, it's going to be through vulnerability. It's an embrace of vulnerability. It's going to be all of us coming together and going, hey, I'm not perfect. You know, it's really interesting when you admit that you're not perfect, how disarming it is. In any context, in any relationship, you can have lunch with a complete stranger and you can open up by saying, I'm not perfect. And all of a sudden, but a lot of times our friendships, our conversations, our relationships are one another just trying to show how great we are. I'm trying to prove myself to you, and you're trying to prove yourself to me, and all we're doing is just trying to one-up each other, and we're just trying to go, hey, and I'm trying to be more perfect than you, and you're trying to be more perfect than me, and we're just stack, 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 and all of a sudden that crumbles. But the moment you say, I'm not perfect, I love when someone asks me a question I don't know the answer to. I mean, I didn't love it, but I'm embracing it now. I'm like, I don't know, let's find out, because that's going, I'm not perfect, and all of a sudden the other person goes, hey, he's not perfect. If he's not perfect, I recognize I'm not perfect. And all of a sudden we build a relationship on something that's so much more pure and healthy than it is upon trying to be someone you're not or trying to be someone that you want to be. And I feel like the quicker we begin to embrace vulnerability, the quicker we're going to embrace connectivity. And I believe so much of what we're lacking in our lives is because most of us are shut down to vulnerability. It just is. We're shut down to it, and we're lacking so many things in our lives, relationships, friendships. We're lacking commitment. We're lacking authenticity. We're lacking so much. Even from God, we keep expecting God to provide for us all these things, and we don't see that he's giving them to us. And it's likely because we're not willing to be vulnerable with God, who already sees straight through you. So it starts with our relationship with God, and then it begins to demand a commitment with the people around us. But I want to ask you in this room, do you believe? Do you trust? Do you know who God is? Are you willing to be vulnerable in this moment to embrace the call that God has on your life? To love him, to take the risk of uncertainty and step into a relationship with God Almighty? That I think this is the first place that we start when we journey on the path of vulnerability. Is we start by going, God, I haven't been honest. I haven't been committed to you. I haven't been willing to risk. We start with a commitment to him. And then we allow that commitment to filter into the lives of the people around us. So if you would go ahead and bow your heads and close your eyes.
For more information on our church and how you can support the ministry, you can visit us online at hamiltonlifechurch.com.